Good morning, everyone. My name is Chloe Little. I am a Hamilton Scholar at Florida International University. And this year, I chose to uplift a platform of cultural equity, a topic near and dear to my heart. I believe that culture through the lens of the performance and visual arts sector can serve as a bridge to identify the spaces and areas we as a nation have to come together to meet in order to instill um, a whole and just democracy. As we begin, I would like to open up with a snippet from the Declaration of Independence that states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It's my belief today that our creators are here to identify what hasn't been evident or what is actually striking as evidence of barriers to these ideas of freedom that our founding fathers mentioned within the Declaration of Independence. As we begin, I would first like to introduce the wonderful leaders that have supported me throughout this whole process, some fellow Hamilton scholars. So I'm going to mention them by name, and then if you all, the leaders I am addressing, if you would unmute yourselves, address your policy, your platform, and maybe share a little bit what culture means to you very briefly. I would like to start with Miss Ziana G.
Hello, my name is Griot, and I'm a member of the Spring 2021 Hamilton Scholars Cohort, and my passion policy area is criminal justice reform, more specifically relating to how the justice system addresses drug-related offenses related to the Black community and the overall effects on the Black community. And to me, culture means unity and diversity.
Thank you so much for your support today, Ziana, and sharing your platform. Next, I would like to bring up Miss Emily J. Okay, we'll give her a minute. Let me go to Anais.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anais Mendovar, and I am a Spring 2021 Hamilton Scholar. And my policy area is education and health disparities, specifically in minority communities. And to me, what culture means is the backbone or the blood of who you are. And I just want to thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much for your support, Anais, and for being here today. I just want to give a shout out to Miss Kay Groover. I don't know if you're in the audience. Awesome. And then we also had Christina Orzuko also help with this process, and Miss Prachi Lawani. She too is a member of the Hamilton Scholar Cohort, and she wanted me to share that her policy focuses on ensuring that women in the South Asian community acquire basic human rights such as educational resources, shelter, a wage earning job search engine, and childcare so that they may be able to flee domestic violence situations. Culture to her is defined as a group of different people with different backgrounds who can make the world a better place when they get together. Moving on, I would like to invite all of you to be active participants in today's conversation. With that in mind, please, throughout the program, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand within the participants column, and I will do my best to get to you. I would also highly recommend that you include your questions in the chat for this program. I may just so happen to ask our wonderful panelists their favorite color. My favorite color is green, and they may be way more interested in your substantial question. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, but also raise your hand. We want for this to be an inclusive and active conversation for everyone. As we begin, let me introduce our panelists today. First, we have Miss Kate Pfaff. She is the Director of Education from the Alonzo King Lions Ballet based out of San Francisco, California. She was a former associate of social impact programs at the Carnegie Hall in New York City. She is an alumna of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Thank you so much, Ms. Pfaff, for being here today. We also have Ms. Niurca Marquez. She is a renowned artist and researcher with a wide range as a creator and performer in film, site-specific work, and stage performance. She is an alumna of Jacksonville University graduate program, where she was also a Gilman Fellow. At the moment, she is a professor at the Florida International University Honors College. Thank you so much, Ms. Marquez, for being with us today. We also have Ms. Janine Christiano. She is the Strategic Funding and Initiatives Manager for Metro Arts in Nashville, Tennessee. She guides Metro Arts grant funding for Nashville nonprofits, Opportunity Now, and equity programs, including Racial Equity in Arts Leadership, acronym REAL. She is very interested in the intersection of art, education, and the economy, and is committed to using art as a catalyst for social and economic change. Okay, so let's just get into the first question. As we begin to open up this conversation of cultural equity, again, I like to reinforce we're looking through the lens of the performance and visual sectors. And according to Americans for the Arts, cultural equity is defined as the embodiment of values, policies, and practices that ensure that all people, including but not limited to, those who have been historically underrepresented based on race, ethnicity, age, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, geography, citizenship status, or religion, to make sure that they are represented in the development of arts policy, the support of artists, the nurturing of accessible, thriving venues for expression, and the fair distribution of programmatic, financial, and informational resources. So I would like our panelists to please take a moment to introduce yourselves and how you contribute to cultural equity initiatives, either through your own personal work or through your organization's mission. I would like to start with Kate, if that's okay.
Hi, everyone. Good morning from San Francisco. Hope all of you are doing well, no matter where you're joining from this morning, afternoon, evening. My favorite color is orange, just to get that inevitable question out of the way. So as Chloe said, I am the Director of Education at Alonzo King Lines Ballet. Chloe was an intern with Alonzo King Lines Ballet in the fall, which is where I had the privilege of getting to work with her. And just want to thank you for including me in today's conversation, Chloe, before we get any further. So what I really see my role in at Alonzo King Lines Ballet is in fostering the next generation of leaders. I work for a dance company. We really think broadly about our work in not only training dancers, but training and supporting humans, supporting creative beings, and encouraging folks to think outside of the specific genre of contemporary ballet or the genre of dance. I work for a Black-led, Black-founded company and think a lot about my role as a white woman in a space where I am working with predominantly people of color. I do a lot of listening. I bring a lot of our students and teachers to the table in making decisions. I feel very fortunate to work for an organization that has thought and been a leader in the cultural equity space for nearly 4 decades now. I think the conversation around cultural equity has shifted, especially in the last year, and it's been really incredible to see many of the internal conversations we have been having at Lines Ballet be happening on a much larger scale. I think in many ways, organizations that have been walking the walk for a long time now have some different language to talk the talk and be more explicit about what their values really are in the arts and how the arts can have ripple effects across all sectors of our culture and of our society. That's a little bit in very general terms about what I do and how I see my role within this particular organization. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists and also receiving some questions from students.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I have to say, while interning with Lines, it was a beautiful experience. It was a lot of listening and conversations that were brought to the forefront directly, which was so nice for to experience in a concert organization. Again, I would like to allow Janine to introduce yourself and how you contribute to cultural equity initiatives, either through your work or through your organization.
Yeah, sure thing. So happy to be here, everyone. So the mission of Metro Arts, which is it's a government agency. It's part of the metropolitan government in Nashville. Is basically there's other words, but to sum it up, it's to create an equitable and vibrant community in Nashville through the arts, through culture. So that's our mission. And I would, just to be honest, I think we are very much in still the becoming stages, although we are a leader and we do push things and we do, bring questions to the forefront of the arts ecosystem in Nashville, to the members of the arts ecosystem. But that's where we are right now. And that is our mission. And that's, we try to have equity as our foundation and the lens we view all of our programming and initiatives, funding all of that. I'm privileged to be on or to staff the Committee for Anti-Racism and Equity, which is comprised of commissioners of the arts commissioners and community experts. I also oversee or directly facilitate all of our equity related programming. So such as the Racial Equity and Arts Leadership Program that Chloe mentioned, Diversity and Arts Leadership, which is a program that Chloe will be involved in this summer. It's a partnership with AFTA. Also, we have various other programs. All of our grants and funding, again, like have equity as their foundation, and we are now including equity scoring criteria in all of our grant scoring rubrics. So, I mean, that's basically it. And yeah, we also have affinity groups for arts administrators, to discuss topics that are, that are important to the community in a safe space, and then bring them together. So there's a lot of programming related to that. And I'm very privileged to be a part of it, as I said. I think that's it in a nutshell. I ask hard questions and I tick people off sometimes, and that's part of the work too. So that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Janine. And I am a newbie to these conversations, but I think, sometimes ticking people off is just an inevitable part of identifying the truth and the reality of where we are. Ms. Niurca Marquez, I would like for you to be able to answer the question as well. How you contribute to cultural equity initiatives, either through your work or through your organization's mission.
So I thought long and hard when you sent that email. And you know what? I think if there was ever a moment to stop being PC about it, it's now. So I've just spent my whole life as an artist as a thorn in their side. I've spent my entire life saying, nope, you think so, but no. I live in Miami. And I've made an artistic career in Miami with years spent in Spain as well. And, there's this fallacy of Miami as this international city where we're, this melting pot and we all get along so well. And, the minority is the majority. So therefore everything runs smoothly. No. Race and colorism is still present. The one-upping each other is still very present. The not recognizing privilege and therefore feeling like that's a green light to just move forward and plow through is still very present. And so 25 plus years of experience in the arts in my, Travis, don't even get me started on the ideology around the melting pot. Yeah, I think it's in my work personally, because of the fact that I've been an artist that has worked in rooted forms. And so as an artist, I've had to deal with with conceptions and ideas in really pretty language about what is going to get programmed. And then when I present the work, myself or other colleagues who work in these forums, we are suddenly not part of the group picked because it's not conceptual enough, or they're not understanding the language in it, or, so part of my work as an artist has been to create spaces where this is addressed. And one of the ways that I'm currently doing that is through an initiative that we've called Faro. Faro in Spanish is a lighthouse, but it also has various acronyms. It's just a variety. None of us can really decide what the heck it actually stands for. But basically, we're looking at how do we make spaces that have traditionally left out women of color in particular? How do we make them accessible? And how do we, in this particular moment in time, how do we rethink what it means, what peer review means, what publication means, what, we toot our horns about how advanced we are and how these, 21st century technologies have given us all these platforms. But when we go up for tenure, we still have to deal with the traditional publications. Here's the 10 publications that you have to have published in order for you to be able to qualify for tenure. So, these kinds of questions come up for me all the time. And especially in the space of being an artist researcher. So I sit in this space that is the middle ground. It's neither here nor there. And that's been my whole existence, my whole life as an artist and as a person. I sit in those gray spaces. I sit in those spaces between, too white for one space, not white enough for another space, too flamenco for one space, not flamenco, not traditional enough for the other. What do you mean you don't have the big flower and the castanets? No, this is experimental flamenco. We're slightly different conversation. So a lot of my work, both as an artist and as an instructor at FIU and as a researcher, has been about pointing out, having the tough conversation and saying, actually, no, this is the reason. I'm that letter people get afterwards. That's really annoying. That's like, no, these are the reasons why the thing you think you're doing, you're actually not doing, right? And so I think a big piece of the work for me is on a grassroots level, but also how do we take that grassroots and take the roots and grow them in the opposite direction and have them start climbing up the institution itself, right? For that reason, I created a Cultural Arts Exchange, which is an organization that's dedicated to expanding this conversation and the offerings of the arts community in South Florida and the Caribbean. So we have programs with right now with Cuba, Santo Domingo, and Puerto Rico. The Spanish-speaking Caribbean was first, just because that's where we had our connections, but we're now expanding that as well, and ties into the Southwestern United States as well. And so through this, I provide art services and programs centered on social accountability. So the programs in their format, in their structure, in their topics, in the kinds of artists that are given space to have a voice, really address this question of who really gets to be on the stage, right? Of who gets to read that poem, who gets to share that new composition. And one of the things that I do through the company is the pulling apart at the structures of how business works in the system. For example, in fiscal sponsorship, right? Utilizing it as an opportunity, since I have the 501c3, to say, okay, let's have the rough conversation about grants. Let's have that conversation about the kind of system you're creating when you're setting us up to be fully dependent on you. And when we say, no, we're not going to be dependent on you, we're going to do this in our own way, now we suddenly don't qualify for other forms of funding because we're not getting the general programming funding from you. So we're not getting money that keeps us running yearly because we've managed to be sustainable because of the kind of setup that we've created. And now that makes us not eligible for specific program funding. So these are the conversations that I engage with. Yeah, sorry, I know that was a little long-winded, but there are a lot of different spokes on this wheel, so sorry.
There definitely are, and I appreciate every second of it. But you alluded to a topic that is really pertinent to my exploration of having cultural equity as a platform with the Hamilton Scholars. In light of the pandemic, Congress passed the CARES Act last spring, March 27, 2020. And then the Payment Protection Program was a big part of that. But surprisingly, 13.7 billion in arts and creative economy loans. Within that amount, 11.9 billion was awarded to for-profit art businesses and gig workers, and 1.8 billion was awarded to nonprofit arts organizations. There's so much to unpack within that, those statistics. In your opinion, why that gap? Are for-profit businesses more culturally engaging? Are they more, like, I guess, equity based? Are they more inclusive? That question goes to everyone on the panel.
I want to point something out really quick. Sorry, Janine. Also note one thing that nobody has taken into account in those numbers, that in the for-profit in the nonprofit allocations, many of the cultural affairs offices opened up the funds from the CARES Act to actually musicians and artists that were part of the for-profit sector. So we also need to understand that that is also going on. And Janine, I'll turn it over to you because I know you probably have a lot to say about this one.
I do, but that's exactly, I mean, it's complicated. So we held just, seminars about how to apply for the funding, who's eligible. It was very confusing. It was, on one hand, a very exciting form of relief that people were, waiting for and anxious about. We had lawyers just picking apart. Luckily, we have access to attorneys, and they were picking apart the language and trying to explain it to people. So there's, and I think that alludes to one of the reasons why some of the arts businesses had a larger chunk of the pie than the nonprofit. There's an access issue. I mean, there's one thing. Nashville is a great example of this. So there was a lot of, in the language of what is an arts business, we have gigantic, venues that were part of that, are part of that number. And so that, I think that's just in the counting of it. But from the ground floor, I heard from a lot of our nonprofit, our grantees, the partners we work for, that it was really challenging. The minute that they got everything up to speed, a lot of that first initial funding was gone. And so, that's anecdotal, but I think it is also supported by data, although I don't have that right in front of me. And so I think that's it in a nutshell. So our for-profit arts business more culturally engaging was the second part of your question. And so, I'll answer no, but what I will say though, in the structure of it, I think the argument can be made that arts businesses might be potentially more nimble in the way that the US, the tax code is structured and the business code and all of those things are structured. So we do, when we have conversations with, artists and artist collectives, thinking about what they should do, how they should form, we ask them those questions. And, some folks go the arts business route, some folks go the nonprofit route. It's challenging. Both systems are imperfect. And I think, I think Niurca was explaining, was kind of what has, talked about that in her introduction. So, anyway, I'll stop for now. Those are just kind of in a nutshell, why the gap, one reason of why the gap, and then also the culturally engaging question. So.
I think there's also the assumption made about nonprofit arts organizations that board members or individual donors or corporate sponsors will step up and fill in gaps that are not provided by the federal government, because the nonprofit model is pre-pandemic incredibly dependent on individual and corporate support as well. The challenge being, and I'll speak to what occurred with Lines Ballet, that many of our extremely generous funders were rightfully choosing to put their money towards COVID research and supporting hospitals and purchasing PPE. So we in no way could, be upset about them and shifting their funding priorities. But I think that the structure of the PPP took for granted the kind of the nimbleness and the flexibility that has previously been exercised in the arts world. And just to put it even more simply, the fact that the arts are creative and we are problem solvers as artists, we were almost punished for that by the assumption being that we could look elsewhere and find support in other areas.
And I think there's a long history of this, what you're saying, Kate, right? It's when you've been in arts administration, because I mean, I've been an artist all my life, but I've had, entries and exits out of the arts administration, right? And I think that when you've been at it long enough, I remember a time when granting was so considerable that you could rely on the grant funds. And the first thing was the grant funds dwindled. So then we had to find alternative modes of, survival. Okay, well, we're not going to rely on grants. Let's see the ways that we, increase our income from other sources. And the first thing was diversify your sources. Then there was the whole, economic disaster of 2008. And all of a sudden we were out again in the cold. And there was a rethinking of how this happened. And I think one of the things that I've seen happen over and over, and I think is what is happening now, is that artists have been saying for a while, the traditional structure of the not-for-profit is not sustainable. It does not trickle down to us. That's not how it works. And so you've created the system that requires all of these other funds going into, general operating and all of these additional pieces that aren't always necessary. Sometimes they're very necessary, but sometimes they're not, right? And so the minute you propose a structure that sits outside of that, where the board member is expected to step up, well, guess what? I'm on 3 different boards, and one of the boards I'm on is almost entirely artists. We don't have a yearly contribution. We contribute because they understand our human value, right, as artists, and what we bring to the table, what we bring to the conversation. And so we problem solve in a different way, and the resources we bring are different. But it's like the bigger system hasn't caught up yet with that conversation. So yeah.
I believe all of your answers kind of alluded to this next question. Can we actually operationalize this idea of cultural equity, not just having more colors, but an actual inclusive platform in our performance and cultural institutions without making measures for accountability?
Not well, right? I mean, not well. I mean, I think we probably, I'll speak for myself. So I try, to operationalize as much as I can within the systems that I can. I try to build in, so for example, I'll use the example of the equity scoring criteria in our grants rubric. So, and we do have an evaluation in place, right? At the end of the year, but it's departmentally, it's one of the things that we track internally, like how well did this, how many BIPOC-led arts organizations were funded at the end of the year? Is there a pay gap between BIPOC versus white artists? And so we track that internally. We're accountable to a certain extent to, not to a certain, we are accountable to the mayor's office. That's like the higher, that's who we're accountable to, and the finance department and all of that. But we're, and they track other things though. So it's like, it's hard. So, but yeah, so I do the best, we do the best we can. That's one example of how we could do better. We're not necessarily accountable to that. It's kind of like for your own information, and we share it and we try and we advocate more and we push farther, but there are other structures in place, and they're looking at different things, maybe not necessarily equity. Like we care about equity as like a foundation, but they're looking at other things. So so I feel like that's kind of my answer. yes, to do this work well, you must incorporate accountability, but that's not always the case. So that's where I'll leave it for now.
Yeah, I've been noticing this kind of like a neglect of accountability. I don't know if you all witnessed the article on Marcia Sells. I believe she's now the Chief Diversity Officer over the Met. But they haven't had this position in over like 140 years. She's a former ballerina with Arthur Mitchell's Dance Theater of Harlem, also former Assistant State Attorney for Brooklyn, who went on to be the Dean of Harvard Law. And throughout the article, eventually they mentioned like there's this shift towards funding for diversity and inclusion. They're behind on funding, especially due to the pandemic. Welcome, Marcia. And I was just like, it's great that you all want to bring her in to do like a form of checks and balances, but clearly there's like a lack of responsibility wanting to be taken there. So that's why I think it's also important to distinguish this idea or the concept of equality and equity. How do you all do that?
I was actually just going to speak to that in reference to the accountability, right? I think the question that we don't ask enough is, what are the tools you're using? What are the measures you're looking at to talk about accountability, right? Because if you're not looking at the link between what that tool or that measure is to accessibility of resources, right? We've got a problem. There is already an inherent glitch in the system, right? And I think that happens way too often, more often than we're willing to recognize. And I think, like I said earlier, the pandemic, I think, has made us realize a lot of things, right? When you're looking at, I remember years ago having a conversation with the folks at NALAC, at the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures. And at the time they were very frustrated because they said, we know that these artists are in Miami, but why is nobody from Miami, applying to this particular grant? And I looked at them and I said, very simple. The things that you're asking for and the platform that you're asking us to put it in, nobody has the resources to create that in the way you're asking for it, right? I said, you've got a large population of artists who don't speak English and don't speak it well enough to write a grant, and certainly don't have the funds to hire a grant writer, right? So very, very quickly they shifted, and many of their applications, especially when they're like the COVID relief one that they just did, the Acto de Confianza, you could submit it in both English and Spanish, right? So suddenly there was a recognition for, okay, this language piece might be a barrier, right? So I think that the distinction between equality and equity sits in, I don't need the same things that someone else does. I need the right tools, and I need you to clear the pathway a little bit so I can actually avoid the potholes. Like, let me know where they're at, because nobody gave me that instruction manual, right? Nobody handed it to me. And I look around sometimes at, those who are navigating with me and not sitting in the space of, who are not BIPOC, and I'm going, how did they know to do that, right? How did they know to do that? Please explain to me, because I missed that memo, right? And then I realized, oh no, I didn't. It's not that I missed the memo, it's that I never got it, right? So this conversation about what is equality and what is equity, it's akin. I always say it's akin to walking down a sidewalk, that has lifted pieces and potholes, and one person has complete function and use of both legs and has a map on their hands and they're navigating and they know where the things are. I've got a limp and you're asking me to you gave me the map, but I've got a limp, and I'm blind out of one eye, right? And now but it's equality. I gave you both the map. Hello, And so, I mean, I'm putting in really, really basic and really crude terms, but that's really what it boils down to, It's not about, don't give me the same things. Look at what I have. Ask me where I'm at. Ask me what I might need, and let me sit with you and try to figure out a way to resolve this situation. Now we can step into a space of equity. Now we can begin to approximate a space of equity.
There has to be intentionality around equity. We do business as usual. We think it's equality. Maybe on a good day, we could call it equality, but unless you are asking these hard questions that Niurca is flagging, it's not equity at all. Where are you sharing information? What language is it in? If you're doing a webinar, do you have an ASL translator? How are you reaching out to new audiences, new student outreach, rather than doing the status quo. It requires a whole entire set of questions that are perhaps, if you're starting this conversation in a space that you're working in, you have to just scrap all the questions you've asked before and ask these really hard, uncomfortable questions. You can't create a system and hope that the outcome is equitable unless you're thinking about equity from the very jump.
Yeah, I'll jump in too real quick. I probably want to go to the next question too, but when you folks that stay, or organizations, whatever, that stay kind of in the equality realm, they're looking at things like in kind of a representational way, kind of like just diversity. It's like, okay, like you said with the new person at the Met, like they just insert a person of color without thinking about power structures, history, and then so it's not a complete picture, and so, I mean, I think that's a thing that, equity at its foundation is thinking about dismantling the structures in place, that have created this inequitable system, and when folks are like, okay, like, are thinking about equality, like Niurca said, okay, like, and like, let's give everybody the same map. Let's give everybody the same whatever. And that's fair. And that's, as in her example, as her example shows, those aren't fair. Something that so this, what we're trying to, we're still working on this tool now, but some questions that we're asking ourselves, we're calling this an equity lens that we're trying to apply, that we're still developing. It includes some questions like in anything we do, like asking ourselves, like, who benefits from this action we're taking or funding we're taking? Who's harmed? Who are the stakeholders? Are the stakeholders involved? Are the stakeholders involved in each level of this planning and decision-making process and the implementation? And where's the feedback loop? Like, all of those things need to be, asked of, organizations, people in power, whatever, when you're thinking about, creating, like, if you want to engage in the work of equity, those are just like the base questions you need to start asking. So that's, in that regards to the equity equality thing, I think it's just one remains in the surface, and then one tries to dismantle something and rebuild something.
I love this reinforcement of asking the questions and then finding the questions that need to be asked that you may not, from your experience, be able to come up with. Speaking of questions, we have a question from the audience. Travis, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you, Chloe. Hello, panelists. My name is Travis. I'm the graduate assistant with FIU in DC. Sorry, I have food in my mouth. That's why I texted. But I mean, how do you make equity more transformative? Because what I'm hearing is a lot of performative efforts, which is cute, but how do we make it transformative?
I'll jump in. I think the first thing that we have to be able to do is hold our, as institutions, hold our fragility, understand that it's there, recognize it, and not use it as an excuse or a crutch. And unfortunately, I wish I were seeing more of that, but it's something that continues to happen. And I think that the only way that that can be done is if we're willing to come to the table, exposed. And the fact of the matter is that most people don't want to do that. And so for me, I'll share a really simple example. I work with a mixed abilities company that also happens to be bilingual. And the other day, somebody who is also, who actually, who self-identifies as a person of color and whose work speaks to the silenced voices of Latinas, et cetera, basically called out the amount of time and resources that it was taking for that company to get up to speed. And it was shocking to me because here's this person who sits in this space, right? And I'm thinking, how does that happen, right? And then simply recognizing that because of the position held in a government office, right? It gets mixed with the, I have to prove, and I am a woman of color and I gotta be 3 steps ahead of everybody else. And I have to hold this rigor, you know, and in holding this rigor, I have forgotten to look at the people that I'm dealing with, right? And there's also this very strange sensation of, if I give them space, then that might call me out. And so it's this really tangled web, right? That requires that we first stop, in my very personal opinion, stop and be able to hold that fragility at a bit of a distance and say, I understand it's here, and and name it and walk in with it and say it's here. So, you know, I may put my foot in it. There may be things I may not recognize, you know, please feel free to call me out. And that's something that a lot of people who are primarily in large arts institutions are definitely not willing to do, right? It requires, you know, Janine was talking about equity being about digging deeper and dismantling and then figuring out how to rebuild. And I think that's the key. I think the fear is in the, wait a second, we get rid of this thing that up until now has worked for us, maybe not for everybody else, but for us. What are we going to put in its place, right? What's going to happen to me? And I think that's, you know, that me-centered question has to be, I don't see any way of entering a space where equity can be transformative if we are not able to displace the me temporarily and look at the us. I just don't see it, you know, and maybe it has to do with coming from a place of community and coming from that, you know, mindset. But I sincerely, I don't see it being able to happen unless we look through that lens of the whole, right? Otherwise we remain in the same, because as long as we stay in the I, it's still me and them, right? It's still whatever I take on is still something, a jacket I'm throwing on, right? So I can step into the space and you know, we have in Cubans have a saying, which is, you know, I'm going to pretend, you know, when we say, how are you doing? You know, they say, you know, here passing, you know, and it says a lot about our history, right? But it's the idea that I'm just going to dress up and I'm going to walk by and pretend like, you know, oh yeah, I'm in, I'm one of you, you know, it's all good. And so, yeah. And so that's why I think we see it as much more performative. But yeah, I think it needs to come from a displacement of the I and trying to figure out, you know, how we get out of scarcity mindsets and the idea that because I'm going to give to this group, now there's not going to be enough for someone else. Well, wait a second. What about the history of it? What about what has happened historically? What about what we can gain when we give various voices the possibility, right? The richness that comes out of that. But I don't think there's an understanding of that yet.
Thank you, Niurca. Very insightful, and I love your candor.
I think that there is, to some extent, a false dichotomy, transformative and performative. I think something can be transformative on the individual or programmatic level, but there is pressure from an institution, from a funder, to make that performative. And that is really challenging at a time where, I will speak for our organization, 75% of our revenue and funding has been cut. We've been able to keep our public programming, our scholarships at 100% of their pre-pandemic level, but I don't know that that's going to be possible for another few years. And so pressure that I personally feel under is to protect as much as possible of that truly transformative work, and not have it be about the performance, not have it be about exploitating stories or talking about what we're doing always, when we know we're doing the right thing. Nobody needs to know about it. We don't need to ask anyone to share what's happening, but there is more and more pressure when our walls are closing in on us financially to do more of that storytelling, because the logic is, if people know how great we are and all the great work we're doing, we're more likely to be able to do more of it. And it's a really, really slippery slope, and goes back to what we were talking about earlier about this not-for-profit board relationship model being more and more, I think, challenging to navigate when there are very true economic stressors happening.
Well, Kate, really quick, I have a question, a follow-up question with that. Then how do you go about allocating funds without pimping out trauma all the time? Because that's what happens all the time. Because as a Black man and a person, it's this dichotomy of I gotta pimp out my trauma to get dollars. How can you do that without pimping out your trauma?
To be frank, our shift has been shifting to focus on our programs that are already designed to be performative, focusing on our professional company dancers who are there to tell their stories, who are adults who can choose when and how to tell their stories, and not focusing so much on our youth programming or our programming for folks with disabilities. That is not only always a popular decision from a funder or a board member who knows that we're doing that behind closed doors, but I feel extremely passionately that we cannot be asking people to pimp their trauma, to pimp their story, to pimp the amount of money they received as a scholarship for our hope that we could recoup that money down the road. That is not right, but it's an uphill battle, and it's been getting more and more difficult a year into the pandemic. I won't lie to you about that.
Thanks, Kate.
And I'll speak to that a little bit. One, I mean, storytelling is powerful, but I think again, it's I think where we need us to have our focus on always is like, where is the power?
Yeah.
If the power of the voice of that story, if the communities, the individual artists that we're working with are allowed to tell their own stories in the way they want, then of course, then that shifts the power. So I think that's one thing, because I mean, I think all of us that are here that are artists, or arts administrators, whatever. I mean, we know that there is a power of performance, and there is a transformative power of art. I mean, that is true. Like, we are the truth tellers, the creators, the innovators, all of that. So there's that's the transformative part of performance and art. How to not make an equity statement performative versus equity programs performative versus transformative. Yeah, your equity programs should not just be performative. Your equity programs need to focus on the power and the structures that you're creating. And so, I mean, I think normalizing and how do I say this? Okay, so I'll start off with the statement that for organizations, people in who are privileged, people currently in power, equity feels like oppression, or can feel like oppression, because there is a sense in the current structure that there is a loss, like Niurca alluded to. Oh, a large organization that has historically been funded regularly, that has been historically white and exclusive, will probably get less funding, and that feels like a loss to them, and then they push back against the equity programs, kind of not understanding or not willing to accept that in the short term, there's going to be a little bit of a loss before all of us can gain from this work, from the fruit of this work. So, I hope, I don't know if I answered your question, but I think just asking to create programs that are transformative, I think, again, you have to return to questions you're asking yourself. What am I willing to lose in the short term to gain in the long term? So can this more sustainable, longer, outlook, and then, and then just like what power has actually shifted? Because if no power has shifted, then it is performative. So that's it.
Thanks, Janine.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Travis, and all the responses. And I have to say, it was such an eye-opening experience being able to intern with the development department of Lines, because I'd been a fan of that company and Alonzo King's work for most of my life, but I did not know how boots to the ground that organization is, and how detailed and transformative the work they do within the Bay Area, but at large on a global scale, that they don't hype out, which I appreciate. But it was beautiful to witness that as a young growing professional. We also have a question from Ms. Ziana. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello, really quickly. My name is Griot, and I'm a Hamilton Scholar for this spring 2021. And my question is, Njorka mentioned that a lot of this I guess a lot of the barriers towards opening this conversation and this pathway towards cultural equity comes from this idea of people essentially grouping themselves off. Like she mentioned that many Cubans will group themselves off, for example, and say, well, I'm worried about myself. I'm not really thinking about this other group attaining, this idea of equity when I'm worried about myself. So I wanted to sort of step back and say, while we're talking about policy, um, how important do you all think it is to consider sort of these more, I guess, social barriers that can be barring this opening of the way to cultural equity? Because at the end of the day, while policy is very important, if the individual people are not necessarily working towards that or understanding that idea, how do you think that is basically stopping successful and progressive policies from being put in place?
I think you bring up an excellent point, Ziana, and I thank you for it. It has to begin on an interpersonal level. It has to begin on a social level. It has to begin, first of all, let's unpack the elephant in the room. The arts are seen as a luxury still, despite everything we have proven about that not being the case, it's still seen as a luxury, right? So, so the arts in general have this capacity to break down some of those barriers, but they cannot by any means be the only place where that happens. It needs to happen across a much broader expanse of our human existence. And you mentioned the idea of groupings, and we live in a country where we use a term Latino, and that classifies this pan-Latino-ness. That doesn't exist. That's a fallacy. And that plays itself out very differently in the Southwest than it does here in Miami. And this is a space that is very delicate for me, and that is very problematic on a personal level, on a familial level. The idea that because again, we carry with us our conceptions of race from our places of origin, right? And we land here, and now we have to somehow navigate them within this other place that is saying, that historically has a one-drop rule. So the kinds of I'm trying to think of a very fancy word to use, but I can't, and I'm not going to say the one I'm thinking, but what it does to people's headspace is really interesting, right? And so I think something Janine was saying about the capacity to step aside for a moment, right, to see what the benefit could be to all, is one that is very difficult to ask of mostly immigrant communities, because the mindset is still survival, despite, I mean, if we look at Miami and we look at it honestly, okay, and we get rid of all of our filters, right? The Cuban economic enclave is at the top of the hierarchy because of its history, right, of the immigrant groups. And it has operated in a very particular way. And I remember now, like, representatives coming to Miami and pulling me aside and going, so we just met with X, Y, and Z, and we are very confused. We're not understanding what's happening here. And I said, yeah, our ideas about accessibility and, equity and resources. And I looked at them and I said, wait, you're confused because the ones oppressing or stopping Latinos are other Latinos? Is that what's happening? Is that what you just realized is happening here in Miami? And yeah, Travis, they had that same reaction. And they went, wow, we're so glad you said that. I was like, yeah, I mean, we have to be able to talk about these things, right, Diana? We have to be able to have the conversations on a social level and say, listen, whoa, we got to understand what's at work here, right? And what's at play here, and what is actually in the room with us. Otherwise, we will remain in the performative, right? Otherwise, we can pretend to set up these spaces, of mutual support as long as we want. But if we don't get to what's at the root of it, right? If we don't, and I think these last elections, I think were so telling, right? And I can speak from that, from my community, from the perspective of my community, is the one I live, right? The things I heard coming out of people's mouths, just floored me, because I thought, wow, you really have never traveled north of West Palm Beach, have you? Right? Like this conception, right? And the privilege that is had by portions of that community without a recognition of where they're actually situated in the conversation nationally, right? And so I think awareness and bringing these, like not being afraid to talk about these things and being willing to put them on the table, right? Yes, it has to socially first, because that shapes how we know, how we think, how we relate, you know. I don't think as arts organizations we can ever expect to be the only ones making the change, or to be, you know, or to, I think that would be falling into the other fallacy, right, of we're the untouchables, we're the ones who have all the, as artists we have all the answers. That's BS as well, right? I think it has to happen across a broad spectrum of society and the members of that society.
Thank you so much. That was a really good response, and it was really eye-opening. I appreciate you for being able to speak about that so honestly and in a way that I think we really need to in order to achieve this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you again. And I know we're coming up on time for our panelists and all the guests here today. If I know we're working through different time zones, but if the panelists are able to stay for the specific questions, I would like to possibly get that in if that's okay, but if not, I completely understand. Okay, awesome. So I will start with Kate. In December of 2020, the Alonzo King Lions Ballet was cited by the New York Times as a dance company that met the moment amid a global pandemic and social uprising. Kate, as a director of education for the organization, I'm curious to learn how specific scholarship programs that prioritize BIPOC students and the One for Me, One for You program came to exist at Lines.
Thanks for your question, Chloe. I will try to be fast because I know we're short on time. Language is very important. The way we talk about our work is very important. As I alluded to earlier, there was a lot of work that was happening behind the scenes that wasn't being named. And this year caused us to ask a lot of those questions about what are we not talking about and why? And sometimes there's really good reasons. What are we talking about and why? This year caused us to step back, evaluate, and revisit some of the assumptions we had taken for granted. The Bay Area, San Francisco in particular, has the highest wealth disparity in the state. As I mentioned, we're under great financial strain this year. One of the programs we did, knowing that in some of our online dance classes, we have people that are in their third home in Napa or whatever, and we have other folks who are artists trying to keep their bodies nimble during this time of social distancing. We started a program that we called One for Me, One for You, where students could purchase 2 classes and have a bank of where dance classes exist, and students of all ages, without having to identify themselves, could use a code, take a class for free, and have the exact same experience as the student next to them, maybe in their mansion in Napa at the same time. But that was something that we really put the onus onto our students and onto our community to help one another out at a time when we knew that our resources were limited. The other program that you mentioned, Chloe, is that we have historically given 80% of our scholarships to BIPOC students, with the goal of bringing that number to 95% next year. The goal of our company is to have a group of dancers that look like the world, as Alonzo King likes to say. We can't expect students to come through the door ready to go at age 21, fully trained, unless we are supporting the pathways up into the company. So it's this moment of pause and reflection has allowed us to reinstate and be more bold in our goals when it comes to representation on the stage, and certainly in our education programs as well.
Thank you so much for being here today, Kate, and sharing that. This next question is going to be directed towards Janine. I kind of alluded to this. Specific arts organizations like the Met, Opera, New York City have made public statements about their optimism for funding due to the recent implementation of diversity initiatives. However, cultural equity seems to be ingrained within the mission of Metro Arts in Nashville, Tennessee. Between a committee on anti-racism, a clear statement on cultural equity, and the Racial Equity in Arts Leadership Program, Janine, how have these initiatives brought about a more united community in Nashville?
So this is one of those tough questions that you ask. I'm like, Well, I'm just going to give the answer. So it has not created a more united community in Nashville yet. That's the goal, right? I mean, that's where we're headed. That's the aspiration. But right now, what it has created is a lot of dialogue, a lot of conversation, a lot of disagreement. I think it's created, there have been moments of unity, and that's exciting. I think, we recently wrapped up a 6-week anti-racism writing project, which was exciting. And so kind of through that process of writing, I think there was a lot of cohesion and the potential for some coalition building and that, but I think that's the goal, and we're not there yet. And that's it for now. I mean, it's a long haul, and there's still so much work to do, and there's a lot of dismantling. There's a lot of things, points of accountability that need to be put in place. I think it's just the start. So no unity yet. Sorry. Check back later.
I have so much respect for you for giving an honest response to that and not, making it performative. This next question is for Niurca. I believe that we must continue to reinforce that the arts are an essential part of the U.S. GDP and not an accessory, but rather a necessity to threading our communities and bringing our nation back together. Njorka, you address notions of identity, cultural memory, and ritual in flamenco with a contemporary framework. You have also been noted on a global scale through your research and choreography to make connections to social discourse and processes of decolonization. Was your work or research considered to be taboo for the concert stage or academia? How do you feel your work is perceived now in this current socio-political context?
So I have to kind of giggle, and I love this question, Chloe. When I read it, I was like, oh yeah, she went there. Okay. How is it perceived now in this socio-political context? It's not. It continues to not be. And has it been taboo in academia? Heck yes. Has it been taboo in the performative stage? Heck yes. Because I forever find myself in these spaces where, especially when we're talking about, the performative inequity, right? Where the institutions, the organizations, right, come up with this really beautiful language of what they want, right? And what they see as the thing they're striving for. And not just myself, but a collective of artists that I work with, will come to the table with exactly what they're asking for. And they go, oh, no, but that's not what we meant. So we have a collective of 5 women artists, right? And we're just a really tightly knit group. And recently one of them applied to a residency. She's on the West Coast, and she had an advocate in the panel. And I say her story because it's the same story we've all lived through numerous times, and we continue to live through. She's a Colombian artist of mixed background, and also working in experimental flamenco and Afro-Colombian forms, in addition to her work as a contemporary artist. And so she had this advocate on the board, and that was, rooting for her. And when the residency results came in, she didn't get it. And so this person called her, and they were having a conversation, and she says, I felt like she kept beating around the bush. And then finally she said, Paola, the thing is that your work just doesn't look like the work of a woman of color. Exactly. And so, she called me and we laughed hysterically, and she says, and our work continues to be invisible. And that phrase has stuck with us. It's like, nuestro trabajo es invisible. It's like, we just continue to weave these strands, right, in the air, and, blood, sweat, and tears, and it continues to be invisible, right? And I think especially when you work like I do as an artist on the margins, and when I say margins, I mean margins on all levels. I mean margins as far as the performative spaces that I enter. I mean margins as far as what I conceive to be a performance platform. My publications, my writing is about choreographing on the page. And I don't even want to get into the constant conversations I have with, copy editors and publishers saying, oh, no, you can't do that to the text. And I say, okay, thank you. It's been nice. Bye-bye. And I consider it I consider it to be a place of privilege that I can say no thank you and walk away. But it's a privilege that I've created for myself. It's not one that was given to me. And it's one that I chose for myself. And it's saying, my artistic integrity is not in your hands. And so it's really interesting to me navigating these spaces, because even where I teach, where I am highly supported, and every insane idea that comes across this mind and across these hands, they're willing to entertain, there's still institutionally there's still pushback, and that's something that I'm okay with, because I think that's part of the work that just needs to get done, right? And I don't think I would use the word taboo. I would definitely use the word uncomfortable. I would definitely use the phrase thorn in someone's side. I would definitely use the phrase, not what we were looking for, right? And it's something that I've accepted as just the space that I navigate, right? Because it allows me to do this, right? To have really the difficult questions, the elephant in the room that nobody wants to point out, from a very small age. I was tasked with that in my family, so I have a lot of practice of going, did nobody realize that, there's smoke coming out of that vent, and everybody else is just turning a blind eye. So, so that's just kind of how I approach life, So even though I address those questions actively in my work, I don't address them politely. I don't address them in a way that I believe to be confrontational, because I really don't. It really is about, this is my search. This is my diving in. This is the diving in of the other artists that are with me, right? And this is what our search has yielded, right? But unfortunately, we're willing to get messy, and not everybody's willing to look at the mess. And that's a real piece of it, So yeah, it's still, I don't think it's changed at all. As a matter of fact, I think what the pandemic has done is, this group in particular, it's required us to go more internal. It's required us to push even further as to what the platforms look like. And we're definitely not the ones getting the grants right now. But it's okay. It's a period of time we've got to navigate. So.
Well, thank you so much for serving that much needed dose of reality. Before I close this out, I would like to open up for all three of you to share some words of hope or truth. I don't, from my experience, I don't see conversations like this needing to be comfortable. I fear this idea of leaving others in comfort is a disservice to those who are marginalized and facing disparity. So whatever you would like to share, here's your time.
I'm struck with something Niurca said that I'm fusing together still in my brain, that there's this undue expectation that arts is an add-on, it's a nice to have, but it should also solve all of our societal ills at the same time, right? That's what's sitting with me and I'm walking away with in this conversation, but I'm so heartened to see faces and names in chat and know that this conversation is happening. That brings me a lot of hope. That's my hope today. And knowing that we solved some of the world's problems, I think, in the last 71 minutes, but certainly not all of them. But all that to say, this has been for me a really fruitful conversation. And Chloe, I think you could cross-register this with a philosophy class or something. I think we touched on a lot of big capital conversations about what is capital A arts, what is lowercase a arts. And I really want to thank you for your leadership today and bringing us all together. So thank you. You give me hope.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I think I will, okay, let me think. Sorry, I should have probably let Njorka speak. So I think a place of hope right now is that place of discomfort. And I think what we have to identify is, and Njorka alluded to it beautifully, I mean, I think the coalition building and like the solidarity that I have seen germinate over this past year and throughout this, in this work. And there, I feel like it's there. And I think if we continue to foster that through the work that Njorka said of dismantling our, as BIPOC artists, as BIPOC administrators, if you are a white ally, co-conspirator, whatever, but like, unpacking that, all of the things within us, right? So like our internalized either oppression, internalized white supremacy, whatever you're holding in, I think that's that's going to be needed for this work. There's so many things, right? Like the access to, the access to power through, the proximity to centeredness and whiteness needs to be recognized and unpacked, and all the things that Niurca said, colorism and all of that. But I think if we continue to work through that, I think there's an opportunity at hand. I feel so hopeful that it's close by. And every time that I go to a committee for anti-racism meeting, and they're always later in the day, they're always like already after 8 hours of work and everything, I'm so energized and I'm so privileged to say, like, I can't believe I get to do this work. This is so great. Thank God that I have a space to process this with like-minded people that are with me, yeah, that's all I'll say for now. So that's what I'll leave you with.
Thank you so much, Janine.
Just before, when Chloe asked me to be part of this panel, I thought, oh, wow, that's the same day as the workshop. And I'm so glad that I said yes, because I taught a workshop this morning in this wonderful conference put together by Michelle Grant Murray, who's a dancer and advocate and artivist and all sorts of things, just incredible woman. And I'm sharing the link there. We're at the tail end of it, but it's a really beautiful program. And this year they decided to focus on healing and restoration. And so for me, what gives me hope is the kind of reimagining and futurism that people are engaging in. One of the things that I talked about today was, science is teaching us that we carry our trauma, right? Genetically, we carry our trauma. What about if we momentarily for ourselves, not an excuse for anybody else, right? Or anybody else's assault, but for ourselves, imagine that, wait a second, if we can carry the trauma, can't we carry the joy too? So what if we suddenly gave that a space to exist and a space to be, right? And what if we were not afraid to pull in everything that we are, like, yes, talk about our ancestors in the room, right? Like that kind of stuff, and not afraid to have the conversation, right? We're all coming from, in Korea, you see advertisements on TV, where the grandfather's sitting next to them, right? And it's the most normal thing ever culturally, right? So what if we gave space for the way that we communicate and that we are as human beings, and we like understood that we carry our joy as well, right? That we carry our lineages, our power, are as disruptive as they may have been, as traumatic as some of the events may have been. There's also joy that's been carried forward. The reason why I said that, and the reason why that gave me so much hope, was because for the first time ever teaching one of these workshops, the room was filled with dancers under the age of 20. And I was in shock, because as a dancer at the age of 45, I was not allowed to have these conversations until I was well into my 30s, And so the fact that these kids are getting this now and being told, yes, like, who are you? Where do you come from? Carry all of that with you into your moving body and bring it into the space, And they've been doing this for the last month, It wasn't just, Jolly Willow Josolar of Urban Bushwomen was one of the invited guests. She's been the keynote. This is the conversation moving right now in a national dance conference. Ideas about healing and restoration. That gives me hope. That might be the conversation happening in an arts space, where for much of my career, what I've heard is, how do you adhere to contemporary ideas about conceptual art, right? To suddenly see this as the line that promotes it, healing and restoration. That's the kind of thing that gives me hope. Conversations like this give me hope. Places where we're willing to have, to call out and to air out the stuff that's been stinking for a while, right? And just, sometimes all you got to do is air it out, and it just disintegrates on its own, Other times, no. Other times you got to get messy, but, that gives me hope.
Well, thank you all. Niurca, Marquez, Pfaff, Janine, Christiano, you all blessed me with so much hope and courage to continue this conversation throughout my career as an advocate, as an artist, as a hopefully potential law student one day. Thank you so much to FIUNDC, the Hamilton Scholars, all the leaders who have supported this event today. I hope everyone here has an amazing weekend. Please do something kind for yourself and then for others. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, and thank you, everyone.